Hello and welcome to Digital Stratosphere, the podcast that provides independent and technology agnostic advice to help organizations through their digital transformation journeys. This show will help you dial in on what it takes to drive a successful digital transformation. You'll learn about the best practices and premier strategies used by industry leaders who have driven millions of dollars in net positive business transformations. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll cover another important element that you need to know to make your digital transformation successful. My name is Sarah Dokovic and I'm your host, and I want to thank you for joining us today. In today's episode, we are going to discuss how technology plays into mergers and acquisitions. Bringing two siloed cultures, processes, and software systems together oftentimes possesses one of the biggest challenges during a merger or acquisition. Eric Kimberling is here today to share his insights on what makes for a seamless and successful merger or acquisition. Eric is the founder and CEO of Third Stage Consulting Group, an independent and technology agnostic digital transformation consulting firm. He and his team have worked with some of the world's leading organizations in their transformation journeys, and they know what it takes to set each project and transformation up for success. Eric, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
Of course, always great to chat with you. Now, let's start from the top, shall we? I imagine that the size and the type of organization plays a role in how smooth or rocky a merger could be. So, what types of mergers and acquisitions often see the biggest challenges during the M&A process in regards to their company characteristics?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, first of all, it helps to back up and look at what are some of the things that need to be considered when you're looking at a merger and acquisition. And there's a whole host of things that need to be dealt with, or certainly need to be addressed in terms of whether or not we're going to integrate or how much we're going to integrate and standardize different functions within a business. One of the biggest things is the business operations themselves. How many business processes are there that are either redundant that we want to streamline, or maybe they're inefficient and we want to streamline. How much are we going to standardize across the different locations? So if we went out and we acquired another company, are we going to expect that those operations are going to merge into the way we operate today, or are we going to do some sort of hybrid? And then there's the organizational piece of it as well, where we have to look at how we're organized and roles and responsibilities and just the overall organizational design, and how is that organizational design going to look in the future state. And then there's obviously the system side of it. What systems is the acquired company using? What systems are we using? And what are we going to do to reconcile any sort of discrepancy there? So that's the backdrop of the sorts of things that typically have to be dealt with. And so when you look at your question around what are the sorts of dimensions that can affect how challenging the merger integration might be, it's typically organizations that are larger organizations. So certainly a bigger company acquiring another big company is going to be more difficult, more complex in terms of bringing all that stuff together from a people, process, and technology perspective. And another big one that oftentimes gets overlooked is the cultures of the organization. And there's a lot of research out there from academics and others that study M&A for a living, and they find that a majority of the problems created by M&A integration is oftentimes related to culture, or lack thereof, or lack of alignment in the culture, I should say. So, for example, we've had clients that are, operate in a very standardized business model, and they're a very standardized, efficient machine. And then they go out and acquire more of an entrepreneurial, flexible, shoot from the hip type of company. And all of a sudden now you've got two clashing cultures there that can create a number of problems. So those are a few characteristics that create challenges or can create more complexity. It's going to be the bigger the company, the more diverse the operations, the more diverse the cultures are, the more diverse or divergent that the systems are. Those are all examples of things that are going to create more challenges or more complexities for organizations going through that sort of merger.
Yeah. And in the scenario that you just mentioned, is there like a foundational element that needs to be established before diving into the technical integrations and adjustments needed to turn two organizations into one?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say the first thing that organizations need to think about and look at are going to be, first of all, the vision of what the company wants to be in the future. And it's not just a high level, one sentence vision statement we have to be thinking about. We have to be thinking a level below that in terms of unpacking the overall vision of the company and defining what the combined strategic goals and objectives of the combined company and the combined entity might be. So, it's a matter of really quantifying and setting quantifiable goals for what it is we expect to get out of this acquisition. And it could be anything from efficiency type of gains where we want to reduce our SG&A costs by X amount because now we've got some more synergy, we've got more scale, so therefore we should be able to reduce our SG&A cost as an example. It could be we're going to provide a better customer experience because now we've gone out and acquired this other capability that we didn't have before, and now we can fold it into our current um, existing offering. It could also be top line revenue growth. It could be that we're expecting that as a result of this acquisition, we're going to drive more top line revenue growth, either because we've expanded our portfolio of products or services, or because we've expanded our sales team, or perhaps we've expanded our geographic reach, our industry reach, whatever the case may be. And generally, a lot of that stuff has been defined as part of the M&A due diligence. So before the company ever went out and acquired this other company, typically they will have defined that as part of the business case for why they want to make the acquisition in the first place. But now, once the acquisition actually happens and the rubber meets the road on how we're going to combine all this and make it all work, we have to further refine those goals and objectives and really make it tangible to where we can not just have a high level business case that gives you the ROI or the justification for making the investment in this acquisition, but now it's a matter of how are we going to achieve that? How are we going to get to that granularity to assign metrics and accountability more at an operational level? And so that's one of the first things, is really getting to the point where we have a clear understanding of that vision.
Mm.
And then there's also the executive alignment too. That's a big one, where getting back to that point of culture that I mentioned before, or misaligned cultures, a lot of times it is even more fundamental than that, in that the executives between the two teams, the acquirer and the acquiree, or the acquired company, oftentimes will have differing goals and objectives and different philosophies on how to run the business. And it's extremely important to spend the time early on in getting that alignment and getting on the same page and really defining what you want to be when you grow up as a combined entity. And so the more time you can spend doing that upfront, we find that typically is going to make the integration more successful.
Absolutely. In a video that you made on your YouTube channel as well, you mentioned that there are different components within a business that should be assessed before diving into the integration of another organization. So, can you talk about what assessments should be made with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different things that need to be assessed. I mean, we talked about culture, and that's something that, again, oftentimes gets overlooked, and that's oftentimes a root cause of why a majority of M&A integrations fail. But then beyond culture, you also look at things like the overall operating business model. So how it is we operate, how we're structured, how we're servicing our customers, how we're producing and delivering our products or services, all that sort of stuff around the day-to-day operating model of how we function now, how we operate, are things that need to be assessed. And that relates to a second thing, which is more your business processes. So you've got your high level business model in terms of just what philosophically you're doing in general from an operating perspective, but then you've got your detailed business processes and detailed day-to-day workflows. And then the other side of it is the people side of it. So really having a good understanding of the way the organization is designed, what your organizational capabilities are right now versus what it is you might need, or the synergies you might get from that in the future. And making sure we're getting the most out of our human capital in that combined entity. So making sure that we identify the best ways to get that synergy of the combined human capital that we'll have in this new combined entity. And ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're doing and what we typically do with clients that are going through this sort of merger integration is sort of a gap analysis that says, here's where we are today, here's what we're getting with this acquisition, and here's what we need to do to close the gap between where both entities are operating today, assuming it's just two companies that are merging. If it's more than that, obviously you have more gaps to deal with. But let's just say it's a parent company acquiring a target acquisition. We need to look at those gaps in terms of people, process, operation, strategy, culture, all that stuff, and make sure that we've identified where the gaps are so that we can get aligned on how are we going to close those gaps. And in some cases, we may decide that it's okay just to leave those gaps. We're going to let the acquired company maintain a certain amount of flexibility or independence in certain areas, and there might be other areas where we're going to make sure we do close that gap. But either way, we want to get an assessment of where we stand in terms of those key areas.
Got it. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about ERP failures and what we can also do to avoid them. And there are also many cases where mergers and acquisitions fail. What leads to a M&A to fail, and how can it be avoided?
Well, what happens a lot of times is that you get a lot of really smart private equity type of guys or gals and corporate executives that have a clear vision of what the acquisition could do to highlight the strengths of the company and to really further the strengths of the company. And it all looks good on paper. The numbers are there. In theory, it should be a really good, solid synergy between the companies. But then when you come time to execute and it comes time to integrate, that's where a lot of companies drop the ball. And it's usually not because the opportunity wasn't there or it wasn't a good fit from maybe more of a business model perspective or more of an extension of the business model. But usually it gets down to key things around people and culture. Um, Culture is a huge one, like I mentioned before, where two very diverse cultures trying to integrate don't match up very well. And you see that a lot. Like there are certain industries, like in, for example, retail, where I remember when Walmart bought the e-commerce provider Jet. I remember they're reading a lot of studies about how there was some difficulty in integrating what was an old, very well established, mature, large bricks and mortar company, which was Walmart. They went out and acquired a high growth, kind of new business model, e-commerce, entrepreneurial type of company. And the cultures were just very different. And on one hand, that's what Walmart was trying to buy. They wanted to buy that e-commerce capability. They wanted to expand their market. They wanted to adapt to the changing market trends, which was moving more towards the e-commerce side of things. And that they did. They did acquire those capabilities. And I think today they still have a lot of those executives from Jet at Walmart. But in the meantime, there was a cultural clash there because Walmart was known for being a very mature company that was focused on driving down cost, whereas Jet, I think, was more of a high growth entrepreneurial company that wasn't quite as focused on cost reduction. So that's just one example of a merger integration that I don't think actually failed, but there were certainly obstacles along the way. And then you read and hear about M&A integrations that fail all the time, where companies just don't quite, the merger or the cultures don't align. I remember when A&L or AOL and Time Warner merged back 20 years ago or whenever it was. That was a big point of contention, was the cultures were just so different that they had trouble integrating those two companies. So that cultural piece of it, you look in history of all the big mergers and acquisitions over time, we see it every day with our clients. That can be a big root cause. So I think the way to avoid it on the culture side is just to make sure you understand that cultural difference and make sure that you have a plan of how you're going to integrate the cultures and how you're going to make sure that the cultures don't divide or create tension and chaos and low morale and all the stuff that you're trying to avoid. And so just going in with eyes wide open, doing an assessment very early in the process and having a clear roadmap to transform the culture in the way you need to is a way to round that. And then the other part, to answer your question, or the second thing to answer your question around why these sorts of integrations fail and what you can do to avoid it, is organizational change management in general. So you're messing with people's lives, you're disrupting very severely the way people operate, what they're used to doing. Not only do they have a new parent company or a new boss, so to speak, when they're being acquired, but now they've got to deal with new roles and responsibilities, new ways of operating, new systems, all that kind of stuff. And so change management is important in any sort of transformation, but it's especially important in M&A integration because it's such a disruptive type of business. Despite the opportunities, it's a very disruptive initiative, I should say. So I'd say those are the two main things are culture and change management. And the key is to really get ahead of it and ideally make that cultural assessment, the change management assessment, part of the early integration plan that you put together for the project.
Yeah, that's great. There's so much change involved. And it sounds like those tactics that lead to a successful merger are similar to the tactics that lead to a successful digital transformation. So what are some of the best practices to building a roadmap and planning out a merger/acquisition integration?
Well, some of it we've talked about bits and pieces of it throughout some of the other questions. It's really a matter of putting a lot of those pieces together. So the first is to do an initial assessment and a gap analysis of where we are today and what we're trying to do to combine the two entities, and um, ultimately looking at the culture, the operations, the organizational design, the technology and the systems, business processes and workflows, basically everything, every part of the two companies that we're combining. What is the current lay of the land, and what is it we want that future state to be, and where are those gaps between where we are today and where we're trying to get? And from that, once we've done that initial gap analysis, that will typically inform what that strategic roadmap and integration plan is going to look like. But the key is to do that upfront assessment to be able to build that roadmap for the merger integration.
Awesome, yeah. And it sounds like there's just like a lot that goes on behind the scenes. And as technology advances and continues building its prominence in business practices, the digital side of a merger will pose as one of the biggest challenges two companies will have to resolve before they can even become one. So very interesting stuff. So when we come back from a quick break, Eric and I are going to dive into specific examples of mergers that have seen success and dial in on what it was that helped them get there. Welcome back to the Digital Stratosphere podcast. I'm Sarah Dogovich, speaking with Eric from Third Stage Consulting about the ins and outs of ERP integrations when it comes to a merger or acquisition. Now, you and your team have personally helped guide some fairly large companies through mergers that had complex integration needs. And I'd love to dive into real-life case studies to paint the picture of what it takes to make a merger or acquisition successful. So can you tell us a bit more about one of the companies you've worked with and why they brought Third Stage Consulting in to help them overcome some of the challenges that they were up against?
Sure. So first of all, I'd say that most clients we work with are growing very quickly, and a lot of those are growing through acquisition. So merger integration tends to be a big part of what we do. It's typically under the guise of digital transformation, but when you peel back the layer or peel back the layers of what is really going on, usually it's the fundamental issue that's trying to be addressed is we've bought these other companies. They're all using different systems, different processes. They have different people, different ways of operating, different cultures, and we're trying to figure out how to pull it all together. And one of the more recent clients we worked with, that's a great case study, just because it was fascinating, and there's so much that we learned from this client in this project. It was I think it was about a $3 billion company based here in the U.S. where Third Stage is based, but as a multinational company that had grown very aggressively with private equity money, and gone out and acquired, I think, right around 40 or 45 different entities and different brands of the same product line that they were selling. They're a sort of a consumer product type of company in the residential space. And what they found is that they had grown like gangbusters. They went out and acquired all these different companies. And the whole idea and the vision behind why they went out and acquired these companies is because they wanted to extend the brands that they had. They wanted to extend the product lines that they had. They wanted to extend the geographic reach they had. So they've quickly focused on consolidating a very fragmented industry. So on paper, the ROI was very solid. There's good strategic thought behind why they want to acquire these companies. But then they looked up one day, and not one day, but over the course of time, they looked up and said, okay, we've got these 40 plus different entities that we've bought, and they're all operating independently and differently, and we're being inefficient, and we can't even track customers across different entities, even though we're the same entity. Customers feel like they're dealing with different companies when they deal with different parts of the company. So the whole idea was how can we integrate this in a way that makes us more efficient, more profitable, makes employees' lives easier because we're all operating from the same playbook, if you will, and ultimately, provides that common customer experience. So it doesn't matter which part of the company a customer is dealing with or what part of the world the customer is dealing with our company. It should feel like the same common customer experience. And by the way, we should be able to cross sell other product lines and other products offered by the other entities when a customer is dealing with any one of those entities. So that was kind of the problem statement, if you will, is they were trying to figure out how to really maximize the value of all this money they had invested in these different entities. So the first thing we did, which took several months of effort, was to go in and assess all the independent operations and understand how were they all operating, what were those workflows, what were their business process models, how were they organized, where were the efficiencies and the strengths, where were the inefficiencies, and ultimately where were the gaps between all these different entities and how are they misaligned. And there's a lot of misalignment in how they were operating, and it ranged from something as simple as we're using different technologies to run our business to things that were more fundamental, like we just have completely different business processes. We have a completely different way of interacting with customers. So it really ran the spectrum of small things to big things in terms of what those differences were. But the key was to go in and assess the way things are today and look at the gaps between the different entities, and then also do a gap analysis between where we were expected or where we were trying to get as an entity as a whole. And once we understood the lay of the land, then we could start to prioritize and say, well, here's the low hanging fruit with the biggest ROI. So let's focus on these things. And from that, we put together a integration roadmap that focused on closing those gaps on really all those areas we've talked about: culture, change management, operations, systems, et cetera. So that was a great case study. I really enjoyed working with that client just because of it was just fascinating to see how fast they had grown and how many acquisitions they had done in a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love how you touched on the first things that you did to basically make that process start, and basically how that set the tone up for the greater integration of it all. So based on our previous conversations, it's also apparent that organizational change management plays a big role in the success of any digital transformation. So what should leaders be aware of in regards to OCM as it relates to specifically to mergers and acquisitions?
Well, I'd say that's probably going to be your most important critical success factor to the integration, is how well you handle change management. When clients approach us about merger integration, usually there's a more something on this that's more on the surface, as far as it's more of a symptom of a deeper root cause. And so usually that symptom might be, hey, we're using a bunch of different systems, and we're just trying to figure out how to integrate or move on to one common business system. Or it could be, our business processes are misaligned. We've got different ways of operating. We're trying to figure out how to standardize our operations. But typically what we find is at the heart of it, kind of the deep underlying root cause of why these projects tend to fail on the integration side isn't because we couldn't figure out how to get everyone onto a common system, or we couldn't figure out how to design a common operating model for our business processes. It's usually because we couldn't figure out how to effectively manage change and make sure that people were helped through the change, and that we were maximizing the value of our human capital management across these different entities that we may have acquired as a company. So change management, it's critical for any transformation. And I always say it's probably the number one success factor for any sort of transformation, whether you're talking digital transformation or business transformation, merger integration, whatever it is. And again, it's because M&A, if you think about it, if you look at, say, a systems implementation, that's a big deal because you're kind of ripping out the way you operate today and putting in a whole new technology that affects most or all of your employees. And that's a big deal. That's pretty disruptive to people's day-to-day lives. But then when you think about M&A integration, it's kind of like a systems implementation on steroids, or take that times 10. And that's how big of a change or an impact it is to employees, because now not only do they have new systems to think about, but they've got new business processes, new expectations. They have another parent company that's probably a lot different than them, especially if they have a cultural misalignment like we talked about before. You've got a different leadership team. You're trying to learn new faces and names, and there's just it can be very overwhelming to organizations. And so you see a lot of turnover oftentimes when there's merger integration. And sometimes that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes there's going to be turnover anyway, but, or a planned turnover, I should say. But what you don't want to do is drain all the knowledge and the human capital that you went out to acquire and the value that's there. So really managing that change and understanding that it's a pretty disruptive change. It's more than just looking, at the ROI in a business case, or looking at strategically how this acquisition is going to help us extend our product line or our geographic reach or whatever. There's a layer below that oftentimes gets glossed over, which is we need to figure out how the organization is going to transition to this new model. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for touching on that. And let's speak to the business owners who are considering a merger or acquisition. So, should a company ever shy away from a company that has a completely different technological structure, even if the merger makes sense, or should that consideration take a side seat to the overall purpose of the merger? So, in other words, are there ever any mergers that should be avoided due to a vast technological difference in each company? Or can all digital differences be overcome with the right team and resources?
That's a great question, and I'd say it depends. I mean, if it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So, put it this way: if you're a company that's going out to acquire another company, and the goal is to really fold that company into your operational model and kind of move pretty aggressively to a standard operating model that the rest of the company is using, then that situation you described with vastly different technologies can be there's more of a gap to fill there, or more of a gap to move toward. But a lot of times there's M&A activity that's focused on going out and acquiring companies, but then letting them operate independently. And if that's the case, then the technology gap isn't as big of a deal. But if you're, say you're a big Fortune 500 company and you're using SAP S4 HANA, and you've been using SAP for 10, 20 years or however long, you've built a really strong capability internally for that technology, and you go out and acquire a company that's using Excel spreadsheets. That's not the end of the world, but that's a huge jump to go from Excel spreadsheets and QuickBooks to now, hey, by the way, you're going to have to move over to S4 HANA. And I wouldn't say that's a reason not to do the merger or the integration or the acquisition, but you certainly want to quantify that risk and the cost and the time it's going to take to get that acquired entity to make that jump. It's going to take longer. It's going to be more risk. You may not get all the way there the way you hope to. So, I'm not a private equity guy or a financial analyst, but there's got to be a way to quantify um, what those potential risks are. And if the benefits are high enough, maybe that's okay. I mean, it's such a no-brainer in terms of the upside that you're willing to take that risk, you're willing to take on those additional costs and whatnot. So it's just a matter of really understanding those nuances. That again, it goes beyond what a lot of private equity guys and gals think about, which is, what is the ROI potential in a perfect world? You have to go a layer below that to look at, well, how, what are the risks of getting there and how likely are we to actually achieve that based on, the technological gap. So it really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. But the key is to really go in with your eyes wide open to understand that and quantify it as much as you can.
Yeah, super awesome advice. Thanks for that. And now, if our listeners want to learn more about the best practices around mergers and acquisitions, what are some resources that you might suggest for them?
Well, I think, keep listening to this podcast, subscribe to it on any of the podcast platforms or on YouTube. And then also, we Third Stage, we have a Third Stage YouTube channel. I have my own YouTube channel as well. And we're constantly putting out tons of content on both of those channels. So look for Third Stage and or Eric Kimberling out on YouTube. And if you just go to thirdstage-consulting.com, that's our website. We put a ton of white papers and downloads and videos and all kinds of stuff out there for companies that are about to go through any sort of transformation, whether it's M&A integration or digital transformation, business transformation. And we're technology agnostic, so we try to take the sales spin out of it and just give practical advice. So I start with those sources.
Awesome. Thanks for that. And we're about out of time, but I wanted to thank you so much for being on the podcast today and for all your knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. And I want to thank everybody here for listening as well. Again, my name is Sarah Dokovic, and we'll see you next time on our next episode of the Digital Stratosphere podcast.